There is a point of land in Sydney Harbour where the water wraps softly around on both sides, and if you stand there in the late afternoon, the light comes off the water in long, warm lines, and the whole world seems to go quietly. Ships move slowly across the harbour. Seagulls drift. And there, at the very end of that long curve of land, sitting right at the edge of the water, as if it grew there naturally, is a building, unlike almost any other building in the world. It is called the Sydney Opera House. Though it is not only for opera. Music of all kinds happens inside it. Plays and dance and sometimes films and all sorts of things that people gather together to hear and see. But the reason almost everyone in the world has seen a picture of it, even if they have never been to Sydney, even if they have never been to Australia at all, is because of the roof. Is because of the roof. The roof is made of shapes that curve and sweep and rise and fall like a lot of things, actually. Some people say they look like sails, big, pale sails catching the harbor wind. Some people say they look like shells on a beach, the kind you pick up and hold to your ear. Some people say they look like the petals of an enormous flower, opening slowly toward the sky. And some people, if you ask them to just look without thinking about it too hard, say they look like nothing else at all, just themselves, just that particular shape, which nobody had ever thought of before. And that, really, is where our story begins. Not with the building itself, but with the shape of it. And with the man who first drew those shapes on paper, in a house far away, in a country where the winters are long and cold and the harbors freeze over in January. Let us pause here, as a story like this one likes to do, and go back quite a way, back to Denmark. Denmark is a small country in the north of Europe, tucked between the cold North Sea and the Baltic Sea, and the Danish people have always been comfortable around water. They have always built good boats. They know how a hull should curve to move smoothly through the waves. They know how a sail should be shaped to catch the wind at the right angle. There is something in the way people who grow up near the sea begin to think. They understand curves and movement, and the way a form can be both beautiful and useful at the same time. In 1980, in Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark, a boy was born whose name was Jørgen Utzon. He grew up partly in the north of the country, in a city called Aalborg, near the water. His father was a man who designed boats, yachts, and ships, and so young Jørgen grew up surrounded by the work of turning a shape in your mind into something real that would sit in the water and float. He spent his childhood watching his father work. He watched the way the lines of a hull went from a drawing on paper to a curved wooden reality. He watched how shape could be thought about and planned, and then built, step by patient step. When he grew up, Bjørn Utzon decided to become an architect. An architect is someone who designs buildings, thinks them up, draws them out, and works with builders to make them real. He studied in Copenhagen, and he learned to look at the world very carefully. He looked at nature a great deal. He looked at seashells and the way their spiral curves follow a perfect mathematical pattern. He looked at the way leaves unfurl and the way waves break. He traveled widely, to Sweden, to Morocco, to Mexico, to China, collecting shapes in his mind the way some people collect stamps or stones. He was always looking, always wondering what a building could be, if only you let yourself think differently about it. And then, in 1956, when Bjørn Utzon was 38 years old, he heard about a competition. The city of Sydney in Australia wanted to build a great hall for music and performance. For a long time, people in Sydney had talked about this. The city was large and beautiful and busy, and it had an orchestra and singers and dancers and actors and all the things you need for a lively musical and theatrical life. But it did not have a grand home for all of that. A place worthy of the harbor, worthy of the city, worthy of the music that wanted to be heard. There was a man, an Englishman named Eugene Goossens, who had come to Sydney to conduct the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. He had been talking about the need for a proper concert hall for years. He wrote letters. He gave interviews. He stood up at meetings and said, in his careful way, that Sydney deserved something magnificent. And slowly, over time, people began to agree. The government of New South Wales, which is the state that Sydney belongs to, decided to hold a competition. They would invite architects from all over the world to send in their designs for a new building on a special piece of land. The winner would have their design built. Simple as that. Or so it seemed. The piece of land they chose was called Billowing Point. It is a narrow tongue of land that juts out into Sydney Harbour, and it has one of the finest positions in the entire city. Water on 3 sides. The great harbour bridge curving away to one side, and the whole sweep of the bay visible from its tip. It is the kind of spot where you feel, standing there, that you are right at the center of everything, and also completely surrounded by sky and water. The point had been used for various things over the years. There had been a small fort there once, in the very early days of the colony. For a long time, there had been a large building called a tram depot, where trams were kept and maintained, which is exactly as useful and ordinary as it sounds, and not particularly beautiful. But before any of that, the point had belonged to the Gadigal people, whose country this had always been. And the point itself was named for a man called Wularawa Benelong, a Wangal man who had lived there in the early days of the colony and who had acted as a kind of bridge between two very different worlds. A diplomat, a connector, someone who tried to help people understand one another. His memory lingers quietly in the name of that beautiful piece of land. So, the tram shed was cleared away, the land was prepared, and in 1956 the competition was announced. Architects from anywhere in the world could enter. All they had to do was submit their designs. More than 230 entries arrived from 32 different countries. That is a great many drawings, a great many ideas, a great many different visions of what a building on that point could look like. The judges must have worked very hard, going through them all. And, from what anyone can tell, they did work hard. Except that somewhere in all that sorting and comparing, a small envelope of drawings was set aside. Perhaps they seemed too simple. Perhaps they were not polished enough. Whatever the reason, those particular drawings ended up in the pile of designs that had been passed over, the ones already decided against. And those were Jørn Utzon's drawings. Now, one of the judges, a very famous architect named Eero Saarinen, who had come all the way from America to help with the judging, arrived a little late. He had missed some of the early sorting. And when he sat down with the remaining designs, he heard about the ones that had already been set aside as not quite right. He asked to see them anyway, just to be sure, so someone went and found Utzon's envelope, and Eero Saarinen opened it and looked at what was inside. And he said, "This is the one." The drawings were not highly detailed. They were sketches, really, flowing lines suggesting shapes rather than spelling them out precisely. But something in those lines was extraordinary. Even on paper, even as just lines and curves, the building felt right. It felt like something that belonged on that harbor, on that point of land, in that particular quality of southern light. Utzon's design was chosen as the winner. He received a telegram in Denmark telling him the news. He was so surprised that he had to read it more than once to believe it. Can you imagine getting a telegram like that? A small piece of paper arriving from the other side of the world saying, "Your drawing won." Your idea, the thing you imagined while sitting quietly in Denmark, will be built in Sydney, Australia, on the edge of the harbour, where everyone who sails past will see it for as long as the building stands. Utzon was thrilled, and also, perhaps, a little daunted. Because the design, beautiful as it was on paper, had not yet been fully worked out. The shells, those great, swooping roof shapes that looked like sails, were drawn. But nobody had quite figured out how to actually build them. Not yet. That problem would take years to solve. Years of careful thinking, of mathematics, of experiments with small models and new materials. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's linger here for a moment on those shapes. The shapes of the shells, the sails of the opera house. Utzon had always been fascinated by the way nature makes curves. A shell on the beach, a nautilus, say, or a scallop, curves in ways that are both random seeming and mathematically perfect. An orange peel, when you pull it away in one long spiral, makes a curve that is somehow inevitable and satisfying. The hull of a boat is curved in a very particular way, worked out over thousands of years of trial and careful error, because that is the shape that moves through water most beautifully. These are not arbitrary curves. They follow rules that nature discovered long before any mathematician put them into words. Utzon was always looking for those rules. Always thinking about how nature's shapes and a builder's shapes might be the same thing. He had sketched the opera house roof as a series of shells curving upward, some larger, some smaller, in groups, leaning against each other like sails. Like whatever you want to imagine them as. There is something generous about a shape that lets you choose your own comparison, but the engineering of actually building them was a puzzle, and quite a difficult one. For several years, teams of engineers and architects worked on how to do it. How do you build something that curved? How do you make all those different shells fit together properly, meeting cleanly where they touch, rising correctly to the height they need to reach? How do you make it strong enough to stand in the harbor wind for 100 years? And then one day, the story goes that it was around 1961, several years after the competition had been won. Jørn Utzon had a moment of the kind that sometimes happens to people who have been thinking very hard about a difficult problem for a very long time. The kind of moment where everything suddenly, quietly, clicks. All the shells, he realized, could be cut from the same sphere. A sphere. A perfect ball shape, if you were to cut pieces from it at different angles and different sizes, would give you pieces that were all curves, all consistent, or related to each other. And those pieces could be arranged in different combinations to make all the different shell shapes of the opera house. Suddenly, all the shells, the large ones and the small ones, the ones facing this way and the ones facing that, were all parts of the same family. All derived from one simple, elegant idea. Isn't that the kind of solution that makes you want to sit quietly for a moment? The answer was, there all along, in the shape of a sphere, waiting patiently to be found. And once it was found, the building could actually be built. Construction began properly in 1959. Well, a little before that, actually, some early foundation work had begun while the design was still being worked out, because everyone was impatient to get started. The foundation stone was laid on the 2nd of March 1959, and there was a ceremony and people in good clothes standing on Bennelong Point, looking pleased and hopeful. The original plan, someone said, was that the building would take about 4 years to build and cost about £3.5 million. Now, those numbers turned out to be quite different from what actually happened. But we'll come to that in a gentle while. First, something rather charming. Building an opera house is expensive. Very expensive. And the government of New South Wales needed to find a way to pay for it. And someone had an idea that was, in its way, quite wonderful. They would hold a lottery. A lottery is a kind of game where you buy a ticket with a number on it, and then numbers are drawn at random, and if your number comes up, you win a prize. People have always loved lotteries because they contain a small spark of hope, a tiny chance of something very good happening. The Sydney Opera House Lottery was created specifically to raise money for the building. People all over Australia bought tickets. Week after week, the lottery ran, and gradually, steadily, the money accumulated. There is something rather lovely about that. The idea that the building was paid for, in part, by the small, ordinary hopes of ordinary people. Each little ticket, each quiet flutter of excitement when the numbers were drawn, contributed something to those extraordinary sails rising on the harbour's edge. A little bit of everybody built into the concrete. The construction itself was enormous and complicated and slow. Far slower than anyone had expected. The site at Bennelong Point had to be prepared very carefully. The foundations had to be driven deep into the rock beneath the harbor, because those great shells would be very heavy and needed something solid and sure to rest on. Hundreds of concrete piers were sunk down into the ground to form the base of the building, long, patient columns going deep into the earth below the water, doing their invisible work. And then the shells. The roof shells. The ones that everybody knows. Each shell is made of a series of ribs, long curved concrete ribs, that reach upward from the base and meet at the top. The ribs were made in pieces somewhere else and then brought to the site and fitted together like a very large and very elegant puzzle. Each piece was carefully cast in concrete, checked, and then lifted into place. More than 2,000 individual sections of rib fitted together piece by piece. It took years just for the roof. The shells rose slowly over many months while Sydney watched and waited. People would walk past the harbor and look at the progress. What was taking shape was unlike anything that had been built before, and even half-built, even surrounded by scaffolding and cranes and the ordinary cheerful noise of a construction site. It was clearly going to be something remarkable. People could see that, even before it was finished. They could feel it somehow. Now, the tiles. When the shells were finally complete, they had to be covered. And for this, Utzon chose tiles. Not the usual kind of tiles you see on a kitchen wall. These were specially made in Sweden by a company that had been crafting beautiful ceramics for a very long time. There are more than 1 million of these tiles on the Opera House. More than 1 million. And they come in two kinds. One kind is matte, with a rougher surface that absorbs light softly and quietly. The other kind is glossy, with a shiny surface that reflects light sharply, catching it and throwing it back. Both kinds are a very pale, creamy white. Not quite pure white, but close to it. The color of a seashell, maybe, or of good, thick paper, or of the inside of an orange, which is a nice thought. Utzon had the two kinds of tiles arranged in a very precise pattern across the shells. A chevron pattern, like a series of V-shapes, repeating across the whole surface. This was not just for decoration. It was so that, as the sun moved across the sky through the day, and as the light changed from morning to afternoon to evening, the surface of the shells would seem to shift and glow and come alive. In the morning, when the sun comes from the east, the shells catch the light in one way. In the afternoon, they catch it differently. At dusk, they seem almost golden. And at night, lit from below, they are pale and luminous against the dark harbor sky. The tiles were shipped from Sweden to Australia in their millions, each one small and quite unremarkable on its own, but together forming that great shimmering surface. It makes you think about how sometimes something extraordinary is made up of very many ordinary pieces, each one contributing just a little, each one playing its quiet part. A million small things becoming one large and beautiful thing. The building grew, and the years passed, and things became more complicated in the way that very large and ambitious projects sometimes do. Jan Utzon had moved his whole family from Denmark to Sydney to oversee the work. He had young children who grew up in Sydney, went to school there, played on Australian beaches. He spent years working closely with the engineers and builders, solving problem after problem, refining and adjusting and coaxing the building into being. But partway through the construction, the government changed. And the new minister responsible for public works, a man named Davis Hughes, had different ideas about how things should be run. He wanted to move faster. He wanted to spend less. He wanted to be more involved in the decisions that Utzon felt were his, as the architect, to make. There were disagreements. They were not the loud kind of argument that makes for an exciting story, just a long, quiet, grinding difficulty between two people who saw the same situation very differently and could not find a way to agree. And eventually, in 1966, Jørn Utzon resigned. He packed up and left. He took his family and went back to Denmark. And he never came back to see the finished building. That is one of the quieter sadnesses in this story. And it is worth sitting with for a moment, without rushing past it. The man who had imagined those shells, who had spent the best part of a decade working to make them real, who had drawn those first flowing lines in Denmark and been astonished to receive a telegram saying, "Your idea has been chosen." He left before it was finished. And he never returned to stand in the harbor and look at what had grown from his. Other architects took over, a team of Australians who completed the building as carefully as they could. They worked hard and they cared about the work. But they were not Utzon, and some of the interior spaces were finished differently from how he had planned them, in ways that were later recognized as a loss. The outside, the shells, the sails, the great sweeping roof was his. The inside told a slightly different story. The Sydney Opera House was completed in 1973. It had taken 14 years to build, not 4, as originally hoped. And the final cost was around 102 million Australian dollars, not £3.5 million as originally estimated. These are very large differences. Enormous, really. And yet, looking at the building standing there in the harbour, it is very difficult to feel that it was not worth every year and every cent. The building was opened on the 20th of October, 1973, by Queen Elizabeth II. There was a great ceremony. There were speeches and music and all the things that go with a grand opening. And inside, in the concert halls and theaters that had taken so long to bring into being, the music finally began. Inside the Opera House, there are actually several different spaces. The largest is the concert hall, where orchestras and big musical performances take place. It can hold more than 2,500 people, all sitting in rising rows around a stage that is carefully designed to send the sound of music washing gently over everyone in the room. There is the opera theatre, smaller and more intimate, where operas and ballets are performed. There are smaller theatres and studios for different kinds of performances. There are restaurants and bars and spaces where people gather before shows and at the interval to talk and look out at the harbour through the great glass walls. because the harbor is always there. Through the glass, through the enormous windows, the water is always visible. The ferries move back and forth. The harbor bridge arches across from one side to the other. The sky changes with the weather, gray and stormy sometimes, blazing blue on others. And the building sits in all of that, perfectly calm, its sails not moving. Because they are made of concrete and tile and patience does not move. Years went by. The Opera House became one of the most recognized buildings in the world. If you asked someone to draw a symbol for Sydney, or for Australia even, many people would draw those shapes. The shells, the sails. Something about them had settled quietly into the imagination of the whole world, the way a very beautiful thing sometimes does. In 2003, Bjørn Utzon was awarded the Pritzker Prize, which is the most important prize in architecture, something like a Nobel Prize, but for buildings. The people who gave him the prize said there was no doubt that he deserved it, that the Sydney Opera House was one of the great buildings of the entire 20th century. He was 85 years old by then, and he received the prize in Denmark. He still had not returned to Sydney. He had not seen the building he imagined standing complete on its point of land for decades. But there is a gentle footnote to all of this, a small and warm one. His son, also an architect, a man named Jan Utzon, was later brought in to help with renovations and improvements to the building. And through Jan, Bjørn stayed connected to the Opera House even from a distance. He was consulted. His wishes were considered. He worked on designs for improvements to some of the interior spaces, things that might bring the building a little closer, slowly, carefully, to what he had originally imagined. The Utzon family had not quite left the story after all. Bjørn Utzon died in 2008. He was 90 years old. He had spent the last 4 decades of his life in Denmark, not Sydney. But the sails he imagined were still there, still rising from the harbor, still shimmering in the southern light, still catching the eye of every ferry passenger and every visitor and every small child who looked up and asked, "What is that?" In 2007, the Sydney Opera House was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That means it is officially recognized alongside places like the Great Wall of China and the ancient ruins of Rome as part of the shared heritage of all of humanity. A building completed in 1973, which is quite recent in the long scale of things, was already judged so important, so genuinely extraordinary, that it deserved to be protected and remembered for all time. And it is, perhaps, because of what it represents as much as what it is. It represents the idea that a building can be a work of art, that a place built for practical purposes, for concerts, for plays, for people to gather and listen, can also be something that stops you very still when you first see it. Something that makes you feel, in that quiet way that beautiful things do, that the world contains more wonder than you sometimes remember. There are roughly 40 events of some kind at the Opera House every single day. More than 8 million people visit it each year, many of them just to look, to walk around, to sit on the broad stone steps by the water and watch the ferries cross. More than 1.5 million people actually go inside for performances. It is one of the busiest performing arts venues anywhere on the earth. And it all began with a sketch. With a Danish architect sitting somewhere in the northern cold, turning ideas over in his mind, the way you might turn a stone over in your hand, and drawing a few flowing lines on paper that somehow, already, contained the shape of something nobody had imagined before. The harbour at Sydney does something particular in the evening. As the sun goes down behind the city and the light begins to soften and spread, the water turns from blue to a kind of grey gold, and the reflections of the city stretch long and warm across the surface. The ferries slow down, or seem to. The sounds of the day gradually ease. And there on Bennelong Point, the Opera House begins to glow. The tiles, those 1 million and more tiles, the matte ones and the glossy ones, the ones that came all the way from Sweden in their careful boxes, catch the last of the evening light and hold it for a moment, just a moment, before letting it go. The shells stand very still. They always stand very still, of course, being made of concrete and steel. But in the evening they seem especially at peace, as if the whole building has been waiting quietly all day for exactly this light, exactly this hour. If you were on the water, on a ferry crossing the harbour slowly, you might look across at the shells and think they look like sails after all. Pale sails, curved full of wind, moving steadily and serenely across the water. You might forget, for a moment, that they are fixed in place. That they have been fixed in place since 1973. That they have watched the sun rise and set over the harbour more than 18,000 times. There is something very calming about that. The thought of something so beautiful, simply being there, day after day, year after year. The ferries come and go. The weather changes. The city grows taller on all sides. People are born and grow up and grow old. And the sails stay. Patient and pale and perfectly curved right at the edge of the water, where the harbour meets the stone. The children who walked past while it was being built. The children who watched the shells rise, rib by rib, year by year, who wondered what the strange shapes were, who tugged at sleeves and pointed. Those children are grandparents now. The building they grew up watching being made is part of the world their grandchildren take for granted, the way every generation takes for granted the things that were already there when they arrived. But someone drew those shapes first. Someone in Denmark, with a father who loved boats and an eye trained for years on the curves of the natural world, drew those lines and sent them in an envelope to Australia, not entirely sure whether anyone would think them good enough. And someone else, arriving late to the judging, pulled that envelope from a pile and said, "This is the one." And many thousands of workers spent 14 years in the sun and the harbor wind, pouring concrete and fitting ribs and placing tiles, one tile at a time, 1,000,000 and more of them, each small and pale and quietly doing its part. And ordinary people bought lottery tickets with small, hopeful hearts, and the money accumulated, slowly, the way all good things accumulate. And a building rose, slowly, on a point of land in the harbor, where water moved on all three sides, and the light was always doing something interesting. And now, it is there. Right now, at this very moment, the Sydney Opera House is sitting in the harbor. The tiles are catching whatever light there is. Moonlight, maybe, if you're imagining it late and still. The water is dark and moving very slowly, in that unhurried way that deep harbor water moves, going about its quiet business with no particular urgency. Inside, if there is a late performance tonight, someone might be singing. The sound would fill the curved walls of the concert hall and flow out toward the audience, all those people sitting very still in the dark, listening. Or perhaps the halls are quiet tonight, and the building is just resting in the dark, the way old buildings do. Settling a little into itself, the way everything settles when the day is done. The sails are pale against the sky. The harbor keeps moving, slow and dark and certain. The water makes its soft sound at the edge of the stone. The sound it has always made at that point of land. Long before there was a building there, or a city behind it. Long before there were trams or forts or lottery tickets or architects with envelopes. Just the water and the light and the long, slow rhythm of the harbor going about its quiet life. And those shapes rising from the edge of it. Those curved white shapes that look like sails, like shells, like nothing else that has ever been built before or since. Still there. Still glowing. Still patient and pale. And perfectly curved. On the harbor's edge, in the long, calm dark.